today is the neurodiversity movement, its history, what it is, what you can do to be a part of neurodiversity and the self-advocacy movement, and related topics. And, we're going to talk a lot about that, but I personally believe that to understand any movement, you have to understand its history. And to understand any movement for rights, you have to understand the history of wrongs that preceded it, that led to it. Many people, look at our Bill of Rights. The United States of America has a Bill of Rights, and they say, oh, well, that's a great document. But to really understand how the Bill of Rights occurred, you have to look at the history of the Revolutionary War. We have a right to freedom of speech. We have a right to a speedy trial. We have a right to not have troops quartered in our homes during peacetime because King George did all those things to the colonial Americans, and so in response to those wrongs, we developed a Bill of Rights. Well, to understand the disability rights movement and to understand the neurodiversity movement, you also need to understand the history of wrongs that preceded them and that led to those movements. And so I would actually like to start our discussion, if I may, 100 years ago. If you go back to the early 20th century, one of the most powerful social movements in America at that time was called the eugenics movement. And the eugenics movement sought to breed better human beings in much the same way that one might attempt to breed better dogs or better horses, and sought to remove from the population those whom eugenicists believed were unfit. Eugenics was very, very popular. It dominated American society. Local communities held eugenics fairs in which members of the public were informed precisely how much money in any given second, hour, or day, or year feeble-mindedness cost the country. Feeble-mindedness was this all-purpose term used to describe people who were considered unfit. Encompassed within it, are people who today might have diagnoses like autism, intellectual disability, epilepsy, or even no diagnosis at all. It was a very broad-based term, didn't have very much specificity. The Supreme Court, in a ruling called Buck v. Bell, ruled that the state could involuntarily, without the permission of the individual, sterilize people, make it impossible for them to have children, in order to advance the eugenic cause. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, in arguing that the United States and the state governments should have the right to involuntarily sterilize Americans. And across the 20th century, tens of thousands of Americans were involuntarily sterilized. If you were a moviegoer in 1917, odds are that you saw a film, it was pretty popular back then, called The Black Stork. And The Black Stork, and was later re-released in the early 1940s under the title of Are You Fit to Marry?, was a propaganda film for the American eugenics movement. And it opens with Dr. Harry J. Hazelden, who, as you'll hear in a moment, was a real doctor. He played himself. Dr. Harry J. Hazelden walking by, on a nice summer day, and walking by this house, and through the window of the house, you could see this person with a physical disability, and the person with the physical disability looked sad, and Harry J. Hazelden turned to the camera and said, well, he's not up to par. He's really not fit, but it's not really his fault. It's his parents' fault for having him in the first place. And then you went into the story of the Black Stork, and basically the Black Stork opens after that initial scene with a mother who has just had a child with a disability, and the child with the disability needs an operation to save his life, to save the newborn's life. And Harry J. Hazelden, who's the doctor in the hospital where this child has just been born, is telling his mother, you shouldn't do the operation. You should just allow the child to die, you know. That's the best thing, really. And there's this other doctor who the movie presents as this very arrogant man. The other doctor is presented as the bad guy, saying, no, you should let me operate to save the child's life. Won't that be great for me? So the movie thinks this doctor who's trying to save this child's life, who's arguing for the operation, is the bad guy. And the mother, you know, because of natural maternal instinct, is about to go with the doctor that is arguing for saving her child's life. And all of a sudden, in the movie, she has a vision of the future. And in this vision, the child grows up, and he's presented as as sickly and pathetic as possible. He tries to join the army, and the army won't take him. Not even Uncle Sam will have him. This is presented by the movie as the ultimate sign that, you know, his life is totally pointless. He can't even join the army. Finally, he gets tired of it, and so he goes and he buys a gun. And he tracks down the doctor that operated to save his life. And he shouts out, "Why did you suffer me to live?" and shoots the doctor. And after this grisly vision of the future, the mother, of course, realizes that, oh, I don't know what I was thinking. Of course, I should allow Dr. Harry Hazelton to just let my child die. And Harry Hazelton does, and there's this vision of the child flying into the arms of this sort of spectral Jesus-like figure, followed by some statistics promoting American eugenics, you know, cue credits. That was the end of the film. What people in 1917 were aware of, and what most people today were not aware of, is that film was based on a real situation. You see, a year earlier in Chicago, Dr. Harry J. Hazelton, who was a real physician, did, in fact, deliver a child who was disabled, who needed an operation to save the child's life. And Harry Hazelton, a proponent of American eugenics, not only refused to provide the operation, but called the newspapers because he wanted to advertise the fact that he was not providing the operation, because he believed that as a matter of policy, the United States of America should allow disabled infants to die. And Hazelton, he was the Jack Kevorkian of his time. He was a wildly popular in American eugenics circles figure. They made a movie out of him. The movie was designed to dramatize the story of Harry J. Hazelton, hero of American eugenics. That was how popular eugenics was in the early part of the 20th century. Now we know, if most students of eugenics know about the history of involuntary sterilization. And people are starting to learn about the black stork. But what many people don't realize is that even though we have made much progress in not involuntarily sterilizing people with disabilities, although it does still happen in this country, even though we've made much progress, there's another more prominent artifact of the eugenics movement that is still in the United States today. You see, institutionalization emerged as part and parcel of the eugenics movement. Institutionalization, the mass institutionalization of people with disabilities, was an article of faith in the eugenics movement. And at one point, 3 in every 1,000 Americans was in an institution. Eugenics sought not only to prevent the propagation of disabled people by involuntary sterilization and at times by advocating murder, but also by removing such individuals from society. And eugenicists thought that by removing such individuals from society, all manner of social ills could be solved. There's this address from the director, the new president of the Missouri Medical Association. It's his inaugural address. The first thing he says to his members, and he says, "We need a policy of mass institutionalization for the feeble-minded. Such a policy could reduce our criminal class by 50%, reduce our prostitutes by 70%, and help us deal with all manner of unsocial creatures such as the hobos, the IWWs, and so on and such forth. The IWWs, by the way, were a labor union. Basically, anybody who was not well liked by the elites of society, who were some of the strongest proponents of eugenics, was considered genetically unfit. And this continued, eugenics continued to be in vogue up until really the mid-20th century. And the main reason why eugenics was the source of a backlash was in the aftermath of World War II, people realized that eugenics was the ideology of Nazi Germany. And there was a recognition that this ideology was in some senses tainted. But this really continued up to and including part of the war. We're going to talk about Leo Kanner in a moment. Leo Kanner was one of the first people to document the autism spectrum, and is considered one of the people to discover autism. But a year before he published the first sort of seminal article describing autism in 1943. In 1942, Leo Kanner was writing one side of a debate in the American Journal of Psychiatry. And the nature of the debate was whether the United States should adopt a policy of euthanasia, of killing disabled people. Leo Kanner argued against it. Foster Kennedy, a prominent neurologist, argued for it. And Foster Kennedy, he tried to present his argument as reasonably as possible. He said, well, first you need to understand that I'm not talking about all disabled people. Some disabled people are very useful. They can do all kinds of things, We can put them to work doing our menial labor. This was their high-functioning argument of their day. But, other disabled people, to allow them to live is just morbid sentimentality. That was his words. In fact, that the attachment of parents to their severely disabled children was considered, in Foster Kennedy's eyes, and in the eyes of many proponents of eugenics and institutionalization, something that was in and of itself pathological. Leo Kanner, arguing the opposite, said, this is horrifying. This is horrifying. Of course we shouldn't do this. Shall we psychiatrists take our cue from the Nazi Gestapo? And given that Leo Kanner was a refugee from 1930s Vienna, those were very powerful, words. This was somebody who had fled the Gestapo. But both Kanner and Kennedy agreed that involuntary sterilization was probably a good idea. So, What's interesting about this is that the journal published an unsigned editorial after the debate. And in journals of medicine and academic journals, unsigned editorials are intended to communicate the position of the journal, the position of the association, agreeing with Kennedy, saying, Leo Kanner makes some good points, but we agree with Foster Kennedy. We probably should adopt a policy of euthanasia. And their point, the journal's point was, well, we'll be different from Nazi Germany because we'll enact legislation describing when you can and when you can't do it. And there'll be all these safeguards. So there's really no parallel with Nazi Germany there. So this was the state of the American conversation on disability, really up to and including the period around World War II. And if you look at a chart of the number of people in institutions across the 20th century, what you see is it starts relatively low because institutionalization on a mass scale is a relatively new phenomenon. It starts relatively low, starts growing very quickly in the early 20th century, and then begins to drop very quickly. Not as quickly as it grew, but still very quickly. in the post-war period. So after World War II, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, you begin to see a change occur in how society views people with disabilities. And there are a few reasons for that change. One of them is the eugenics movement was considerably weaker after the war because of being tainted by the association with the Nazis. But another was you had veterans coming home from the war, often with very significant disabilities. And this is a pretty common theme in disability history. Disabled veterans tend to get treated better than just regular run-of-the-mill disabled people. So there was a lot of investment in rehabilitation technology. There was, some effort to kind of maybe help some of these people get jobs, and a little bit of that trickled down to, run-of-the-mill disabled people. Another thing that was interesting is during both World War II and the Korean War, conscientious objectors, people who were pacifists, they refused to fight, were put to work doing national service in institutions. And it was one of the first times that members of the general public actually interacted with people in institutions or saw the conditions there. And so many of them wrote about their experiences, and that served as some of the early motivation for deinstitutionalization and community integration. And you also started to see the beginnings of the civil rights movement. And as women's rights and African American civil rights and many other kinds of civil rights advocacy began to catch on, people in the disability community started to say, well, why not us? And you begin to see in the 1960s the start of advocacy for disability civil rights. So let's pause for a moment, because we're going to talk about disability civil rights in a moment, because it's a critical part of understanding the neurodiversity movement. But before we go into the disability rights advocacy, the modern disability rights movement, from 1960s to the present, let's talk about what's happening in the autism world. Because remember, I said in 1943, Leo Kanner published an article that was the first, or is generally attributed to be the first description of autism. And Leo Kanner was doing his work at around the same time as another person was doing similar work. Hans Asperger published a very similar article in Vienna in 1944. But Leo Kanner's work was much more popular, the reason being that in 1944, for reasons that are all too understandable, German was not the world's most popular scientific language. But Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger were describing relatively similar phenomena. In fact, some people try and say, well, Kanner, was describing people, who couldn't talk, and Asperger was describing people, who didn't have any kind of speech delay. That's not really true. Both of them, if you look at their research subjects, were actually describing a fairly diverse description of what we would today call the autism spectrum. Kanner, in his writings, however, tended to think that what he had discovered was, at first he viewed it as a variation on schizophrenia. He called it childhood schizophrenia. And then he was of the belief that it was very rare. He unlike Asperger, who tended to view autism as something that probably existed to a significant degree in the general population, and probably Asperger would not have been very surprised by today's incidence statistics of between 1% to 3% of the population being autistic. Kanner thought autism was something that was very rare, and he also entertained the idea that it might be, rather than genetic or neurological, thought it might be psychiatric in nature. Well, Kanner had something to do with that idea that autism was something that was psychiatric was really popularized by another, kind of infamous name in the autism world called Bruno Bettelheim. And Bettelheim, massively popular, massively damaging. force in the autism world in the 50s and 60s, and to some degree after that, popularized the idea that autism was caused by poor parenting. He called it the refrigerator mother hypothesis. Basically, Bettelheim's refrigerator mother theory said that autistic children are withdrawn because their mothers are cold towards them. And that's why autism occurs, you know. It's because of poor parenting. And, you know, to validate this, he pointed to, well, you know, many of the mothers that I've observed don't even hug their children very much. Well, you know, I think those of us who are autistic know that many of us don't really appreciate sudden hugs. And so, in fact, you know, many of the mothers that Bettelheim was slandering were, in fact, just being respectful of their children's boundaries. But Bettelheim being, again, you know, the guy was kind of like the Dr. Phil of his day, you know, invited on talk shows, you know, everybody knew who he was. He was a big deal, you know, he was kind of a macher, you know, big deal. So Bettelheim was able to popularize this refrigerator mother theory, and it did a number of things. First, it ruined a lot of families' lives. Second, it made it so that autism was not a very popular diagnosis to seek out, because if you had an autistic kid, you were a refrigerator mother. So, you know, it was your fault. That was not a great incentive for this diagnosis. Third, it led to the popularization of many kind of sort of Freudian, pseudoscientific interventions that are still very popular, particularly in France and many French-speaking countries today, that are predicated on the idea of trying to basically, you know, communicate, make the child non-autistic by kind of smothering them with love, and very unpleasant things were done in this name. But fourth, and perhaps most importantly to the American autism conversation and the later rise of the neurodiversity movement, it set parents and the scientific community against each other at a very early stage, and made the focus of the early autism parent movement on what causes autism, and separated that early autism parent movement from the larger developmental disability parent movement and the larger disability rights movement. Because in the very early years of autism parent advocacy, there had to be a focus on causation, on figuring out what causes autism, because parents were being accused, parents were being attacked. So if you are engaged in autism parent advocacy in the 1960s, you're probably not going to be putting the same kind of focus that people in the intellectual disability community are putting on building supports and services and access to public education and so on and such forth. You are often focusing more narrowly on this question of causation because that's defensive for you. That's just trying to free yourself of this slander that Bettelheim has put on you. The problem is that even after the refrigerator mother theory was disproved and was no longer so popular, the idea that autism parent advocacy was separate and different from the larger disability rights advocacy movement, and the idea that the focus of autism parent advocacy should be on what causes autism rather than on services and supports, stuck around. And if you go forward, you know, into the post-Bettelheim era, in the late 60s, early 70s, what you see is a number of people emerge that were well respected by parents because they opposed the refrigerator mother theory, but were doing terrible things to autistic people. Bernie Rimland is one legitimate claim to fame, was that he played a very big role in disproving the refrigerator mother theory. And he was, you know, as a result of that, lionized by a great many parents. It's very popular. But Bernie Rimland also had a very damaging role in the autism community because he played a very big role in popularizing the idea that autism was supposedly caused by vaccines, by immunization. And this was very popular in the autism parent movement, in part because it sort of turned the refrigerator mother narrative on its head. Oh, the doctors say that I caused my child's autism. Well, now I can say that you caused my child's autism. So, you know, this is something that's very popular with parents who are understandably very much aggrieved. And Rimland also popularized all manner of pseudoscientific treatments that often were very dangerous. Rimland was of the opinion that autism was so horrible, was so bad, that really parents should be willing to try pretty much anything to try and make their child, you know, non-autistic, no matter what the potential consequences were. And his Autism Research Institute, which exists still today and does these things still today, was a very big force in popularizing chelation, in popularizing secretin, in popularizing any number of treatments for autism that were not supported by science and were in fact very dangerous. Now, around the same time that you have Rimland, and by the way, I should mention one more thing about Rimland. Rimland was a big opponent of deinstitutionalization. Rimland thought that deinstitutionalization advocates were, he called them, advo-zealots. You know, he said these people, they are trying to engage in the dangerous delusion, he said when talking to parents, that your children are not really handicapped. That's his terms. These very famous Rimland essays as late as the 90s, where he talks about beware the advo-zealots. You know, we should reopen the institutions. There's one where he says, where it's titled Community My Foot. Rimland was a very big opponent of deinstitutionalization. But at around the same time as you have Rimland, you also have someone called O. Ivar Lovaas. And Lovaas was another very popular figure in the early autism world, and is considered sort of the father of applied behavioral analysis in the autism context. And Ivar Lovaas had two projects at UCLA in the 1960s and 1970s. The one was something called the UCLA Feminine Boys Project, in which he tried to recover, quote unquote, children that were deemed at risk for homosexuality. And the other was the UCLA Autism Project, where he tried to do much the same thing for children who were autistic. And one of Lovaas's projects is considered very disreputable today. The other is the basis for a disturbingly large amount of modern autism intervention. I'll leave it to you to figure out which one is which. But Lovaas was of the belief that through behavioral intervention, autistic children could be made, and I quote, indistinguishable from their peers, end quote. Now I have to ask you, you know, when you wake up in the morning, do you ask yourself, you know, how can I be as indistinguishable as possible today? That's not really a person-centered goal.